wake up and the first thing you feel is wet. The straw beneath you is damp. It has been damp for weeks. The walls of the house, if you can call 2 stacked stone walls and a thatched roof a house, bleed moisture every morning. You don't think about this. You've never known anything else. You pull your legs from under a rough wool cover and place your feet on a dirt floor that holds the cold like a stone holds shadow. The fire from last night is down to ash. You rebuild it before you do anything else, because without it, the morning is simply unbearable. Outside, the village is already moving. Not loudly. This world doesn't have the energy for noise. Men move toward the fields. Women carry water from the well. Children, those who are old enough, follow adults because children here are not a separate category of human life. They are small workers in a world that needs all the labor it can get. You join the movement. You don't eat first. There is nothing to eat yet that isn't rationed in your mind before it touches your mouth. The air smells of animals and smoke and mud. The road between houses is not a road. It is a trench, worn into the earth by 10 generations of feet and wheels and hooves. When it rains, which it does often, that trench fills and becomes something between a path and a river. You walk through it anyway. You always do. Your feet know no other surface. At the edge of the field, you stop. Something is different today. A sound is missing. Normally, from the direction of the river, you can hear the miller's wheel. This morning there is nothing. Silence where a sound always was. You don't know why yet, but you feel it immediately and without words, the way an animal feels a shift in the wind before the storm arrives. Something is wrong. It has been wrong for months in ways you don't have names for. And today, for the first time, that wrongness has a shape. Medieval Europe worked. That is the first thing to understand. It functioned as a system. Not comfortably, not generously, but it functioned. What it did not do was care whether you specifically survived it. The world you are born into in 1348 is not chaos. It is hierarchy. It is order. It is a structure so old that no one alive remembers its construction or questions its logic. At the top, there are lords. They own the land. Not just the soil, the trees on it, the water running through it, the animals moving across it. They own your access to all of it. You are a serf, or close enough that the distinction barely matters. You work the land. In exchange, you are permitted to live on it and to use a portion of what you produce to feed yourself and your family. This arrangement is not described to you as exploitation. It is described as God's design. The church, which is the most powerful institutional force in your world, teaches that every soul occupies a station in a divine order. The knight protects, the priest prays, the peasant labors. To resist your station is not merely political rebellion, it is spiritual disorder. You don't have the vocabulary to think outside this system. The system is the entire world you know. You owe your lord labor, typically several days a week on his land before you touch your own. You owe tithes to the church, 1/10 of your harvest, your animals, your production. You owe fees for using the mill to grind your grain, the oven to bake your bread, the river to water your fields. Every transaction passes through a toll. Every resource has a keeper. You don't own the tools you work with in any permanent sense. You don't own the well. You don't own the road. What you own is your body. And your body is what this system runs on. Now that you know who you are, the next question is inevitable. What does this life ask of that body every single day? The work begins before sunlight and it ends when the light fails or the body fails, whichever comes first. There is no concept of a day off in the way a modern person would recognize. There is Sunday, which is for mass and not for rest in any full sense. Livestock still need feeding. Water still needs carrying. The sick still need tending. The agricultural calendar dictates the rhythm of life with an authority that no lord can override. Planting season doesn't wait. Harvest doesn't wait. The weather doesn't wait. You plow with an ox if your village is fortunate enough to keep one. If not, you plow by hand, bending your body into the earth for hours, turning soil that has been worked for so many seasons. It has been depleted to a fraction of its original yield. Crop rotation exists, but is imperfectly practiced. The same fields grow the same grain until the land gives less each year. You don't measure this decline in numbers. You measure it in the heaviness of the sack at harvest time versus 5 years ago. Skeletal remains from this period, examined centuries later, tell a consistent story. Spinal compression from years of bending and carrying. Worn joints from repetitive motions starting in childhood. Bone density consistent with chronic low-level malnutrition. Not starvation, not dramatic famine, but the sustained caloric and protein deficit that comes from a diet that is mostly grain, rarely supplemented by meat or fat. Your body is working harder than it is being fed. By your late 30s, if you reach them, your body looks decades older than your age by modern standards. Teeth worn and decayed from coarse bread ground with stone fragments that end up in every loaf. Eyes strained from squinting through smoke-filled interiors, hands cracked and scarred from cold tools and constant moisture. This is not a failure of individual will. This is the physical cost of being alive in this economy, written directly onto bone and flesh. And even this, the grinding, exhausting, bone-wearing labor, is not enough to guarantee that you eat. The harvest of 1347 was not a disaster. It was thin. Across much of Western Europe, the growing season had been cut short again by the irregular, cooling weather pattern that had been destabilizing agriculture for decades. The grain that came in was less than the year before. The grain stores going into winter were lower than they should have been. This was not news. It was a continuation. The problem with food security in 1348 is not that people don't know how to grow things. It's that the entire system operates without margin. A family that produces enough in a good year to feed itself, pay its rents, tithe to the church, and set aside a small reserve is doing well. But that reserve is designed to survive one bad season, not two, not 3 consecutive years of diminished yield, which is what the Little Ice Age had been quietly delivering since the beginning of the century. Grain is the foundation of everything. Bread is not a food. It is the food. It makes up perhaps 70 to 80% of the calories consumed by a common person in this period. Pottage, a thick-boiled mixture of whatever is available, grain and sometimes root vegetables and rarely anything else, fills in the rest. Meat is occasional, seasonal, and mostly the privilege of those who have animals they can afford to slaughter. A family that eats meat more than a few times a year is prospering by the standards of this world. When the grain runs short in late winter, before the next harvest arrives, there is a period, weeks, sometimes months, that people simply call the hungry season. The poor eat bark, they eat roots, they eat seed grain that they know they need for spring planting, consuming the future because the present is starving. Parish records from these decades show spikes in deaths in late winter and early spring, not from dramatic famine events, but from the steady attrition of bodies that came into the cold already depleted and could not absorb the additional deficit. You are born into this margin, or rather, you are born into a world that has already spent it. But even if the harvest holds and the bread is enough, there is a threat already moving that no granary can stop. The body, in 1348, is a site of constant negotiation with illness. Modern medicine has so thoroughly restructured the relationship between humans and microbial disease that it is almost impossible to inhabit, mentally, the vulnerability of a medieval person's immune reality. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, skin infections that, without antibiotics, progress from a cut to a death sentence within days. Childbirth that kills 1 in 10 women, higher in years of malnutrition when bodies cannot sustain the physiological demand. Infant mortality so normalized that many families did not name children until they had survived their first winter. There are no doctors in any village. There are healers, women who hold the accumulated botanical and practical knowledge of generations, who know which plants reduce fever, which poultices draw infection, which teas ease the cramping of a diseased stomach. This knowledge is real. Some of it works, but it operates entirely without any understanding of what causes disease, which means it operates without the ability to stop transmission. You don't know what a germ is. You don't know what a bacterium is. You don't know that the water you drink, drawn from the same source that your animals use and that your waste drains near, is carrying organisms that are making you sick. Illness, in this world, is interpreted theologically. God sends suffering to test faith, to punish sin, to call souls home. The correct response to illness is prayer, confession, and submission to divine will. This is not irrationality. It is the only framework available. There is no competing explanation. So when a disease appears that doesn't behave like any disease anyone has ever seen, when a man healthy at dawn is dead by nightfall, when the swellings that appear under the arms and in the groin burst and bleed and carry a smell that clears a room, there is no institutional mechanism to respond to it. No quarantine procedure that works consistently. No treatment that addresses the cause. No way to understand that the rats in the granary, the fleas on those rats, and the bodies pressed together in church each Sunday are nodes in a transmission network that is about to dismantle this world entirely. The plague doesn't announce itself. It arrives the way all catastrophes do in this period, quietly, carried by someone who doesn't know they're carrying it. And then, there is something that the chronicles only approach sideways. Something that writers of the time record and then seem to pull back from, as if the act of writing it down makes it more real than they can bear. In the months after the plague begins to move through a community, something happens to the social order that has nothing to do with the disease itself. Something happens to people. It starts with abandonment. Physicians, the few that exist, stop entering the houses of the sick. Priests delay or refuse to administer last rites to plague victims. Parents, in documented cases that appear in ecclesiastical records and in the accounts of chroniclers who survived, leave infected children. Children, in other documented cases, leave infected parents. Not because these people don't love each other. Because the disease is so fast, so visible, and so total in its death rate that proximity to the dying looks, from the outside, like a reliable path to joining them. One Florentine chronicler, writing during the plague's passage through his city, describes neighbors shutting their windows when they hear someone ill crying for help in the street. Not out of cruelty, out of a rational fear that has overwhelmed the social architecture of care that normally holds communities together. This is what a 50 to 60% death rate does to behavior. It doesn't just kill bodies. It destroys the predictability of human response to suffering. The church legislates against leaving the sick unattended. You don't write laws against things that are not happening. The very existence of those prohibitions confirms that abandonment was widespread enough to require a formal religious injunction against it. And yet the laws couldn't stop it, because the fear was more immediate than the doctrine. When the swellings appeared on your neighbor's neck, the theological argument for staying lost to the biological argument for leaving. This is not a moral failure. It is what happens when a system of social obligation collides with the annihilation of everything that system assumed would survive. The legal and institutional response to the plague is, in most places, almost entirely absence. Not because lords and magistrates don't care, but because no existing legal architecture was designed for a catastrophe of this speed and scale. The feudal system is built around stability, fixed obligations, fixed relationships, fixed hierarchies. When 30% of a village dies in a month, None of the fixed things apply anymore. Labor law, such as it exists, assumes a surplus of workers competing for land and wages. When the plague removes half the labor force, the entire economic logic of serfdom inverts. Suddenly, surviving peasants are scarce. Lords who lose their serfs to plague cannot automatically replace them. Surviving workers begin to understand, many for the first time, that they have leverage. They begin to move. They begin to negotiate. They begin to demand wages. The ruling class responds not with reform, but with legislation. In England, the Statute of Labourers is passed in 1351, attempting to legally freeze wages at pre-plague levels and bind workers to their original parishes. In France, similar orders follow. The message is direct. The system will not adjust to the new reality. The system will force the new reality to conform to the old structure. It does not work. The demographic gap is too large. The movement of labor is too widespread. Courts are overwhelmed with cases of workers accused of leaving their lords. But the courts themselves have lost judges to the plague. The enforcement apparatus is staffed by the same depleted, traumatized population it is trying to control. Law here is not justice. It is panic encoded into statute. The sound of an institution insisting on its own relevance, while the ground it stands on dissolves. In the world of 1348, the category of vulnerability is not shared equally. Women who survive the plague survive into a world whose legal and social institutions do not recognize their agency as independent. A widow, which many women become within weeks of the plague's arrival in a community, occupies a precarious position. She may hold land by custom, but that holding is contested immediately by male relatives, by the lord of the manor, by the church, which has its own interests in the inheritance of deceased parishioners. The labor shortage that gives male survivors negotiating power does, in some documented cases, extend to women who take on work roles previously held exclusively by men. Records from the period after the plague show women working as blacksmiths, as brewers, as traders, in capacities that would have been socially excluded before the population collapse. This is not liberation. It is the labor market filling a vacuum with whatever bodies remain. And those bodies, when the population recovers, will be expected to return to their prior positions. Young women without family networks, those whose parents, brothers, and husbands have all died, are among the most exposed people in the post-plague landscape. The protective structures of family and community that normally mediate risk are gone. What remains are institutions, the church, the Lord's household, the convent. Each offers some form of safety. Each extracts something in return. The convent offers shelter in exchange for a lifetime of enclosure. The Lord's household offers protection in exchange for labor and dependence. These are not free choices. They are the options that remain when every other option has been buried. First, the priests stopped coming. Then the physicians stopped coming. Then, in some villages, everyone stopped coming, and no one was left to notice.
Thank you.
The cascade of failures in 1348 and the years immediately following does not unfold as a single dramatic collapse. It unfolds as a sequence of smaller failures, each one removing a support that the next structure in line had always depended on without knowing it. The church loses so many clergy to the plague. In some monasteries, every single member of the community dies within weeks, that it begins ordaining priests without the standard years of preparation. Doctrine, already stretched thin by the theological impossibility of explaining why God would allow this, is delivered by men who barely understand it to congregations, who are no longer asking theological questions. They are asking practical ones. Where do I bury them? What do I do when there is no one left to dig? The economic collapse arrives with a delay, but arrives completely. The disruption of the agricultural labor force means fields that are not planted, harvests that do not happen, grain prices that spike to levels that place bread out of reach for the poorest of the survivors. a grotesque inversion in which the people who survived the plague cannot afford to eat in its aftermath. Trade networks that ran through the ports where the plague first arrived contract. Merchants who carried goods across the continent carry the disease instead, and the connection between commercial prosperity and epidemic transmission becomes apparent to some observers even without the vocabulary to explain it scientifically. The family, the smallest unit of survival, dissolves in the most personal way. Household records, wills, and parish registries from the plague years show the same pattern repeatedly. A husband dies, then a wife, then children, then sometimes the entire line. Properties with no living heirs. Land reverting to lords who are also dying. A bureaucracy of inheritance overwhelmed by the speed of extinction. What is left after the cascade is not rubble. It is something more disorienting than rubble. It is a world whose structures are still standing, but whose people are not inside them. People continued. That is the fact that the death toll obscures. In a town that loses 60% of its population, 40% survive. Those survivors do not stop. They bury what can be buried. They plant what can still be planted. They rebuild household structures with whoever is left. A man who has lost his wife and 2 children does not stop being a farmer. A woman who has lost everyone she was born among does not stop baking bread if she has flour. What changes is the weight of the world they carry forward. Chronicles written by survivors do not, for the most part, read as records of devastation. They read as records of continuation. Entries that note large numbers of deaths in one line and then move immediately to the price of grain, the date of the next festival, the dispute between 2 landowners over a boundary. Not because these writers are numb, but because continuation is the act that their world demands of them. Grief, in this context, is not a season. It is a current that runs underneath everything, always, and the people living in it have learned to move through it rather than stop for it. The resistance here is not heroic. There are no speeches, no declarations, no named monuments. There is a child fed despite having nothing to feed it with. There is a neighbor's field plowed by someone who has no obligation to plow it. There is a woman who walks to the next village to find someone who knows how to read, because the priest who knew is dead. These are not dramatic acts. They are the acts of people who have decided, without words, that the alternative to continuing is unacceptable. That decision, made millions of times across a devastated continent, is the only reason there is a Europe on the other side of 1348. When you imagine the Middle Ages, you may imagine something with a kind of coherence. Castles, knights, clear seasons. A world that was hard but comprehensible, where people knew their place and their purpose, and the rules were at least consistent. This is not a lie exactly. It is a selection. It is the part of the record that survives in stone and legend, not in the dental records of a malnourished child or the account of a town magistrate trying to find enough living men to serve on a jury. The people of 1348 did not live inside a tapestry. They lived inside a system that was already at its margin when the worst thing that had ever happened to it arrived. They lived without the tools to understand what was killing them, without the institutions capable of stopping it, without the social structures robust enough to hold when the losses hit 40 and 50 and 60%. They lived, most of them, with an unshakable conviction that the world had meaning and that suffering was purposeful, a conviction that the plague tested with a ferocity that no theology was equipped to absorb. What they built on the other side of it was different, not better, not immediately, not in the ways that matter most, but different. The labor shortages cracked the foundation of serfdom. The institutional failure of the church accelerated questions that would, a century and a half later, produce the Reformation. The encounter with mass, arbitrary death, shifted the culture's relationship with mortality in ways you can read in the art, the literature, the architecture of the decades that follow. None of this was worth the cost. That is not how history works. History does not offer refunds. It offers only what comes after, shaped by what was lost. If this version of history, not the romanticized one, but the real one, is the kind of story you want to understand better, then you're already in the right place. On this channel, we reconstruct the worlds that textbooks flatten into dates and dynasties.
And we try to make you feel what it actually costs to live in them. Leave a comment below with one honest answer. Do you think you would have survived 1348? Not as a soldier, not as a noble, as an ordinary person, in a village, in the wrong year? The next world we reconstruct may be even less forgiving than this one.